President, the American people have walked through a Supreme Court nomination many times. There's a normal process of walking through a Supreme Court nomination. They're nominated by the president. There's a background check that's done that's extensive. They then meet with every single senator, whoever wants to be able to meet with him privately. They turn in documents so that everyone can read through their background, their writing, getting details, getting interviews, anything they've ever written, whether it was writing for their law school journal or writing an article for a sports magazine. Everything they've ever written is turned in. Everyone goes back through that. Once they go through all 100 senators or whoever wants to be able to meet with them, the Judiciary Committee meets with them. They'll do a week of hearings. They'll do extensive work to be able to talk through everything. Outside witnesses will come in and will talk about their life. There's a confidential meeting that happens with all senators to be able to sit down and say there were some private accusations that might have been made or some issues about your finances or things that we saw in your background report we want to ask you about confidentially. And then after all that is done, then there's time for questions for the record. And anyone who still has a question can submit it to the nominee, and then it's time for a vote. That's how it's typically done. And quite frankly, that looked like how it was being done this time with Judge Kavanaugh. He was nominated by the president. He turned over documents, and boy, howdy did he turn over documents. There was an enormous number of documents that were turned over by him and that were requested and continue to be requested. Brett Kavanaugh ended up having 480,000 pages of documents that were turned over to the committee. It's more than the past 5 Supreme Court nominees have turned over combined. There were 57 days from the time that he was nominated until the time that actually began the first hearing with the Judiciary Committee. That's longer in a period of time than it was for Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kagan, or Justice Sotomayor. So there's a long period of time between when he was nominated and when he actually came. There were more documents that were turned over than any other person. He went through the hearings for 5 days. He went through all the confidential meetings and those private meetings. He went through every private meeting with every senator that wanted to be able to meet privately, and then it was time for questions for the record. Right at 1,300 questions for the record were given to him as a follow-up after his hearing. That is more questions for the record than all Supreme Court justices combined in the history of the country. After all of that was done, then a bombshell was dropped. You see, a month and a half before all of the end of the hearing was done, a lady named Dr. Ford had sent a letter to one of the other senators here, to the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, saying, I have a concern from a memory that I have from high school time. That letter was turned over July the 30th, early in the process, while Judge Kavanaugh was still meeting individually with senators, before any hearings, before the classified meetings, before any of the questions for the record, before any of that. It was turned over early. Apparently, the ranking member's staff reached out to her then, had a phone call. The ranking member had a phone call, and then that information was held. And apparently from her own testimony, from Dr. Ford, then she was advised by the ranking member's staff, you need to go hire an attorney and to go prepare yourself. And then nothing was said for a month. And then 2 days before the hearing from the Judiciary Committee, suddenly a leak comes out of the committee from somewhere, and there's a story in the newspaper about this accuser, and everything begins to break loose. You know what's interesting is accusations like this are made for a lot of different nominees of all different types and have been for years and years and years. And so there's a process to be able to handle this. When an accusation's made like that, you give it to the FBI early. They include it in their background check to be able to walk through it early. You sit down in confidential meetings so that accusers don't have to go through all the public scrutiny. And you resolve it in a private setting, bring in as many witnesses as you want to be able to talk through it, but you don't want an accuser to have to be public in it because they don't like to be public. This is something very private and personal to them. But that's not what happened for Dr. Ford. It was saved. She was just told, get an attorney, you're going to need it. And then her story was plopped out into the news, forcing her out, making her sit in front of the American people and dragging the American people through an exceptionally painful season in our country's history. At the end of that, there was a hearing many Americans watched, riveted, trying to figure out who's credible, how do I follow the story. All this testimony came out from Brett Kavanaugh, who adamantly, forcefully denied anything like this had ever been done with Dr. Ford or any other person, unequivocal. Dr. Ford said, I 100% remember this, and here are the 3 people that would also corroborate my story. They were there. There was a push from my Democratic colleagues to say this investigation has been done by the committee. We want the investigation done by the FBI. With the unequivocal statement of, during the Anita Hill hearings in '91, the FBI took 3 days to do all the investigation. We want 3 days. Give the FBI 3 days to be able to do this. And then it came back later. Give them a week. Give them a week. That's all it would take. So a decision was made to pause and to give the FBI time to do it. And here were the instructions to the FBI. Research any credible accusation. No boundaries, no limitations on them. Research a credible, current accusation. It wasn't just keep adding forever. If there was new accusations that came in, there'd have to be a new conversation. But any one of them that's come in, and by that time, they had started rolling in. So the FBI was told, just go look at them all. And they were given instructions. No one was tracking from the House or the Senate of either party. FBI do their task. They come back several days later now with the report that a lot of American people know is now stored downstairs that every senator has the opportunity to be able to go through. Pages and pages of testimony where they went through all of the individuals that were claimed to have any kind of alleged firsthand knowledge. All the individuals that Dr. Ford had stated, those 3 individuals were there. They can testify on my behalf. And then it was the list from Brett Kavanaugh's calendar saying, here are all the individuals that went to these parties. And so the FBI went through and interviewed them all. The FBI also went to Mrs. Ramirez saying, we'll take a look at this. Even though even the New York Times wouldn't take that story when it was offered to them, they spent a week researching it, calling around, as they said, to dozens of people to find anyone that could corroborate Mrs. Ramirez's story, and they couldn't find anyone, so the New York Times walked away from it, but a different periodical printed it anyway. The FBI went to Mrs. Ramirez, interviewed her, and interviewed everyone that she said would corroborate her story. At the end of that investigation, all those reports came in, and we've now read through them, and every single one of those individuals reported back, I don't remember anything like what they're describing. Not only do I not remember anything like what they're describing, I know Brett Kavanaugh. I can't even imagine he would do something like that. Person after person after person, instead of agreeing with their story, the accusation, actually agreed with Brett Kavanaugh instead. What's interesting is Brett Kavanaugh has been through 6 different FBI background checks in the past. He's now had 150 people in his life that have been interviewed. Interestingly enough, one of the questions to all 150 people in his life that have been interviewed, leading up before this time even, was one of the questions that the FBI asks everyone when they're doing a background check. Do you know of any issues this person has with alcohol or drug use that would be a problem for them in serving? Do they have a problem with drug and alcohol use? Every single one of those people, from 2 decades of background checks, 6 different times in his life, all of them reported, no, he does not have a problem with drugs or alcohol. There's been this aggressive move over the last couple of weeks to transform a person into a monster. In fact, some of my colleagues on this floor have labeled him as evil, and anyone who supports him is evil. It's the transformation of a person's reputation for political gain. And the other accusations that I've seen in the media have been fascinating to me. I keep reading in the media for the past several weeks, there's another accuser, and the big story will come out, there's another accuser. But they don't ever seem to print the next day when that accuser recanted, as many of them have. Story breaks out one day saying, here's the story that I remember, and tells this whole sexually explicit story. The committee then contacts the story and the individual and say, under penalty of perjury, would you be willing to testify to us of your story? Instead of saying, yes, I'd be willing to agree to that story, their response that came back to them was, I made a crazy mistake, I apologize, I recant my story, rather than face perjury and try to testify. There was an accusation that came from an anonymous person in Colorado saying, I know I saw Brett Kavanaugh in this year at this time slam his girlfriend against the wall in this public place. Except the problem was the girlfriend that he had at that time came out publicly and said that never ever happened, and can't imagine Brett Kavanaugh doing that. Or my favorite one, the accusation that was printed, another accuser comes out, ends up being a person that had written in a tip saying there was a really salacious frat party at Brett Kavanaugh's fraternity after he left Yale. That was a really big party, and it was really out of control. I bet Brett Kavanaugh came back to that party after he was out of college. I bet he came back and went to that party. Someone should check. That was the big tip. This has really gotten out of control. This started with a serious accusation from someone that we should take it seriously when there's an accuser, from Dr. Ford, to be able to get the facts and the information. And it suddenly spun out of control into random smear campaign to try to destroy someone personally. The facts that have come out have not corroborated any of the accusations. In fact, they've done the opposite. But it's done tremendous damage to a family and to a reputation of someone who has served our country admirably for a long time, and who up until the last 2 weeks had a stellar reputation, which has been trashed for political gain. I grieve for the people that have experienced sexual assault in their life. I spent 22 years working with students in youth ministry, and I've met lots of families that have had lots of pain in their life. It's very real in America how we deal with sexual assault. People need to be believed and things need to be taken seriously. But when the facts all come out, we also have to make decisions based on the facts, not on the accusations. This is a case we have to be able to deal with the facts. I will vote for Judge Brett Kavanaugh to be on the Supreme Court, based on his decades of record, based on now 7 FBI background checks about him, based on 65 ladies that have come forward that knew him from high school and college that said, this is the Brett Kavanaugh that we knew. And it doesn't seem anything like all these accusations. Based on 150 different people that the FBI privately interviewed and asked about his alcohol use over the past 20 years, even reaching back to college friends to say he was ever out of control in his alcohol use. All of those saying no, all of them saying no. Not based on a couple of recent accusations, over decades of history. Now I get there are people that will disagree on this for political reasons, or they may not like Brett Kavanaugh's positions on legal issues. I get that. But let's not smear a man's reputation forever because we don't like his opinions on something. Where do I think we go from here? I think there is something we can gain as a nation from this painful experience. And if there's any one piece of advice that I could pass on to the country as a whole and to us as leaders, is to encourage families in taking care of their kids. As I read all these stories, and I've gone through all of them show some markers in it that I look at and say there's some need for some conversation. I think moms and dads should sit down with their daughters and should lovingly say to them, if there's ever anything that happens to you, if any boy ever does something inappropriate to you, if he ever touches you in any way, we want you to know that we love you, we believe in you, and you can come tell us right away, because we want to make it right as soon as possible. Do not be afraid to come talk to us about it. We will not blame you. We want to make it right. That conversation that moms and dads can have with their daughters could have great benefit to a lot of daughters for a long time. There's a conversation that moms and dads need to have with their sons and daughters about alcohol use. Because in all of the stories that I've read, all of them involve teenage drinking, all of them. Dr. Ford admitted drinking at the party even that she described. All of them involved drinking and drug use. There's a conversation that moms and dads can have with their kids. Because I, quite frankly, have met way too many parents that have said, I know my kids are going to drink, I just tell them not to drink and drive. If they're going to drink, just stay over there, or come to our house and drink, and that'll be fine. Well, it's not fine. There are an awful lot of 15 and 16-year-olds that do not have the maturity to handle alcohol. And when parents sign off on it and say that's okay, they need to understand there are very real consequences. I've not asked Judge Kavanaugh about it, but I bet he'd love to take back some of his drinking when he was in high school and college. So wait till he's more mature, because he was telling painful stories. So encourage parents to be parents and to step up and help protect their kids so they can make better decisions. Maybe a good lesson for us as a nation to be able to pass on to our kids. And one last lesson. We have got to learn how to disagree about political issues without destroying someone personally for the sake of gain on anything in politics. We have got to learn this lesson. Because in the days ahead, no matter what your political party is, no matter who's president, no matter who's nominated, we want the best and brightest of our country to step up. We want them all to be able to come serve their country. And I've not met a perfect person. What's been interesting to me is the number of times that I've had Democratic colleagues say to me in the last week and a half, you know, I really hope they don't go through my high school record like we're going through Judge Kavanaugh's record. The number of times I've heard folks say, you know what I really want said at the committee hearing? I want someone to step up and say, he who is without sin should cast the first stone. But that hasn't been said. Maybe an ounce of compassion and a tremendous amount of affection for those who have suffered greatly from assault would be of great benefit to us as a nation, as a community, and as a Senate. With that, Mr. President, I yield back.